Everyone treats Family Guy like a cartoon built purely to shock people for a cheap laugh. Fans call it harmless, critics call it lazy and crude. Fox's own executives saw something far more dangerous hiding inside certain episodes. And that is exactly why, in this video, we break down every controversial episode Family Guy has ever made. Family Guy is one of the longest-running shows on television, and it is also one of the most talked-about shows for all the wrong reasons. Before it became known for jokes that made people angry, before Parents Television Council press releases and network standards meetings became part of its story, the show almost did not survive long enough to make anyone mad at all. Fox canceled it not once, but twice, in the span of just a few years. Understanding how close the show came to disappearing for good helps explain why it eventually leaned so hard into material that other shows would never touch. A cartoon that fought to stay alive twice in its first few seasons stopped worrying about being liked by everyone, and that mindset shaped almost every decision that came after. Family Guy first aired on Fox on January 31st, 1999, right after the Super Bowl, which was one of the biggest advertising spots a network could give a brand new show. Seth MacFarlane created the series and voiced several of its lead characters, including Peter Griffin, Stewie Griffin, Brian the Dog, and Glenn Quagmire. That alone made him one of the busiest voice actors on television, jumping between four very different voices, sometimes within the same scene. The show followed the Griffin family living in the fictional town of Quahog, Rhode Island, and it borrowed some obvious ideas from The Simpsons, since both shows centered on a dim-witted father, a patient wife, and a group of kids with very different personalities. Critics noticed the similarities right away, and were not shy about pointing them out, which meant Family Guy had to fight for respect from the very beginning instead of being welcomed with open arms. The early seasons did not have an easy time finding a stable spot on the schedule. Fox moved the show around to different nights and different time slots, which is one of the fastest ways to lose viewers who are used to watching a program at the same time every week. Despite the shaky scheduling, the show built a small but loyal group of fans who liked its fast pace, its willingness to jump into random unrelated jokes called cutaway gags, and its refusal to take anything seriously. Still, a loyal core of fans is not always enough to keep a network happy, especially when the ratings numbers are being compared side by side with other shows airing at the same time. Fox measured success in numbers, not passion, and the numbers were not strong enough to guarantee the show a long life. By the time the show reached its second season, its future was already shaky. Fox made the decision to cancel Family Guy after that second season, ending its run in the year 2000. For a show that had only been on the air for such a short time, this looked like the end of the story. Cartoons that get canceled this early rarely come back, since networks usually move on to the next idea and put their advertising money elsewhere. Family Guy did not have the massive following it would eventually build, so there was no obvious reason for Fox to bring it back once the door had closed. What happened instead was unusual for its time. The show got a second chance and returned for a third season, but that chance came with a heavy price. When season 3 finally arrived in July of 2001, Fox placed it in one of the worst possible time slots the show had faced yet, airing on Thursday nights at 8 o'clock. That time slot put Family Guy directly against Friends, which was one of the most watched sitcoms in the entire country at the time, pulling in a massive nightly audience that had followed the show for years. As if going against Friends was not difficult enough, that same time slot also had to compete with the reality show Survivor on CBS, which was drawing huge numbers of its own during a period when reality television was still a fresh idea to most viewers. Going up against two ratings giants at the same time left Family Guy with almost no room to grow an audience, no matter how good any individual episode might have been. The ratings during this stretch dropped even further than before, and the pressure inside the network grew along with it. Executives look at numbers on a weekly basis, and week after week of poor performance against two dominant shows made it very hard to justify keeping Family Guy on the schedule. There was no dramatic on-air announcement or special goodbye episode built around the decision. Instead, Fox simply chose to pull the plug again in 2002, canceling the show for a second time after just 3 seasons. This second cancellation felt more final than the first, since the show had already been given one comeback chance and had still struggled to hold on to a large enough audience. There was even an episode from that run that had been finished and ready to air but never got the chance to be shown on Fox at all, since the show was pulled from the schedule before it could reach viewers there. For most shows, this kind of ending would be the last chapter. Once a series is canceled twice by the same network, the odds of ever seeing new episodes again shrink to almost nothing. Cast members move on to other projects, writers find new jobs, and the show becomes a short-lived memory instead of a long-running series. At this point in the story, nobody involved with Family Guy had any real reason to expect the show would ever return to television. The Griffins were, as far as anyone could tell, done for good. Then something happened that very few shows in television history had ever experienced before. Cartoon Network picked up the rights to air reruns of Family Guy on its late-night programming block known as Adult Swim, a place built for adult-oriented animated shows that could air content too crude or strange for daytime television. Cartoon Network reportedly picked up these rerun rights for a very low price, since nobody at the time expected old episodes of a canceled cartoon to draw much of an audience. What happened next surprised almost everyone paying attention. The reruns became one of the most watched programs on the entire Adult Swim block, pulling in around 1.9 million viewers on a regular basis, according to reporting at the time. People who had never seen the show during its original run on Fox were suddenly discovering it late at night, and people who had watched it the first time around were rediscovering episodes they had missed. At the same time this was happening, something just as unusual was taking place in stores. The DVD box set for the first season of Family Guy started selling in huge numbers, eventually passing 2.2 million copies sold. That number made it the second best-selling television show DVD of its kind at the time, sitting just behind the first season set of Chappelle's Show, according to reporting from the period. Selling that many copies of a show that had already been canceled twice was almost unheard of. DVD sales are usually strong for shows that are still airing new episodes and building fresh excitement, not for something that had already been pulled from the air with no future episodes in sight. The fact that so many people were still willing to buy physical copies of old episodes told Fox something important about the size of the audience that had been building quietly in the background the entire time. Word about the strong reruns and the surprising DVD numbers eventually made its way back to Fox executives, who had to reconsider a decision they had already made twice. Seeing a canceled show perform this well after the fact put the network in an unusual position. Most of the time, cancellation decisions are treated as final, since bringing a show back requires convincing writers, actors, and crew members to return to a project they may have already moved on from emotionally and professionally. Fox decided the numbers were strong enough to take that unusual step anyway. In 2005, 3 years after the second cancellation, Family Guy returned to television, with new episodes making up its fourth season. This made Family Guy one of the very first television shows to be brought back from cancellation, specifically because of strong DVD sales, combined with high rerun ratings, rather than because of a fan letter writing campaign or a different network stepping in right away to save it. The impact of surviving 2 cancellations in this specific way stretched far beyond just getting more episodes made. Being saved by reruns and DVD sales instead of live viewership sent a clear message to everyone working on the show. The audience that mattered most was not necessarily the one tuning in live on a Thursday night against Friends and Survivor. It was the audience willing to buy box sets, watch reruns late at night, and stay loyal even when the show was technically dead. That kind of audience tends to enjoy content that takes bigger risks, since they are not casual viewers who happen to land on the channel by accident. They are people who sought the show out on purpose, often because it felt different from anything else on the air. Once Family Guy came back in 2005, it carried the confidence of a show that had already been counted out twice and had still found a way to survive. Shows that have never faced cancellation often play it safe, worried about losing the audience they already have. Family Guy had already lost its audience twice in a sense, only to watch that same audience track it down anyway on DVD shelves and late-night reruns. That kind of survival story tends to loosen the grip that fear usually has on a creative team. There was less concern about losing viewers who might be offended, since the show had already proven it could survive without traditional viewership numbers holding it up. This attitude showed up clearly in the years that followed, as the show moved toward material that dealt with religion, race, gun violence, abortion, and other topics that plenty of other comedies avoided completely. The show has continued to run for over 2 decades since that comeback, becoming one of the longest-running scripted primetime shows in American television history, trailing behind only a small handful of shows like The Simpsons and the Law & Order franchise in terms of total years on the air. Along the way, it also returned to Adult Swim years later under new licensing deals, showing that the relationship between Family Guy and late-night reruns never really disappeared even after the show found a stable home on Fox again. The show that once could not hold on to a Thursday night time slot against Friends and Survivor eventually became a fixture that outlasted both of those programs by a wide margin. Knowing this history changes the way the more controversial episodes of Family Guy can be understood. This was never a show that built up years of goodwill and trust before starting to take risks. It fought for its life twice before most viewers even had the chance to fully commit to it, and it came back only because a stubborn audience refused to let it stay canceled. That kind of beginning tends to produce a show willing to gamble, since the biggest gamble of all, coming back from the dead, had already paid off once before. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not long after settling back into its new life on Fox, the writers turned their attention toward a finished episode that had been sitting untouched for years, one that Fox had been too nervous to air even before the show had been canceled the first time. That episode dealt with faith, money, and a group of people the show had not yet dared to make fun of in a full episode built entirely around them. Section 02. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein. Long before Family Guy became known for episodes that networks refused to air more than once, there was a single half-hour that carried that weight all by itself for years. It sat finished, ready to broadcast, and then it simply did not appear. No other Family Guy episode from that era faced anything close to that kind of delay. While the rest of Season 3 moved forward and aired on schedule, one episode about faith, money, and a bar mitzvah sat in a drawer at Fox for so long that some of the people who eventually watched it barely remembered the show had ever gone through the trouble in the first place. That episode was called When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, and it became the first episode in the history of Family Guy that a network refused to put on the air. To understand why this particular episode caused so much hesitation, it helps to look at where the show stood at the time. Season 3 of Family Guy aired during 2001 and into 2002, right in the stretch of the show's life that ended with its second cancellation. The Griffins were still finding their footing on Fox's schedule, competing against powerhouse programs and struggling to hold on to a stable time slot. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein was actually written and finished earlier than that, intended to air as part of the show's second season back in the year 2000. It was pulled from that schedule before it ever reached viewers, and Fox held on to the finished episode rather than airing it right away. Eventually, the episode was folded into the tail end of season 3 instead, since it needed to go somewhere once the show kept producing new material. Even that placement came with a catch, since Fox still would not let it air on the network during that period. The episode ended up becoming the 22nd episode of season 3, making it the finale for that season, and the 50th episode of the series overall. Yet it carried none of the usual celebration that comes with a season-ending episode, since almost nobody outside the studio had actually seen it yet. The episode was written by Ricky Blitt, one of the show's writers during that era, and directed by Dan Povenmire, who worked on numerous episodes of the show during its early seasons. The voice cast for the episode brought in some recognizable names outside the normal group of actors who voiced the Griffin family. Mark Hamill, known for playing Luke Skywalker in the Star Wars films, provided guest voice work for the episode. Ed McMahon, a longtime television personality known for his decades on The Tonight Show, also appeared as a guest voice. Peter Riegert voiced a character named Max Weinstein, the Jewish accountant at the center of the story, and Ben Stein, an actor and commentator known for his dry, flat delivery style, voiced a character called Rabbi Goldberg. Having this many recognizable names attached to a single episode showed that the production side of the show treated it as a normal part of the season, even while the business side of the network treated it as something too risky to broadcast. The reason Fox held the episode back had nothing to do with production quality or animation problems. The concern from network executives centered entirely on how the episode handled its subject matter, specifically its jokes about Jewish people and Judaism. Fox's own standards department raised concerns that the material could be seen as reinforcing negative stereotypes about Jewish people rather than simply poking fun at them in a lighthearted way. This kind of concern is common in television, where a joke that writers see as clearly making fun of prejudice itself can come across differently once it reaches a wide audience without the writers there to explain their intentions. Fox chose caution over risk, and rather than editing the episode or asking for changes, the network simply chose not to air it at all, letting it sit unused while the rest of the season moved forward without it. This kind of delay builds a strange kind of tension around a piece of entertainment that never gets the chance to reach its audience. An episode that never airs cannot be judged, praised, or criticized by the public, since nobody outside a small circle at the network and the studio has actually seen it. For 3 years, When You Wish Upon a Weinstein existed almost like a rumor among fans who had heard whispers that a finished episode was being kept off the air somewhere. Meanwhile, the show itself faced its second cancellation in 2002, and the eventual comeback driven by strong DVD sales and Adult Swim reruns, which brought the show back to Fox by 2005. Through gaps in cancellation, revival, and a return to production, the Weinstein episode remained untouched, still sitting exactly where Fox had left it years earlier. The episode finally found its way to an audience through a path that avoided live television broadcast entirely at first. In September of 2003, the episode was included on the second DVD volume release of Family Guy episodes, giving fans a way to watch it for the first time without needing Fox to put it on the air. Just 2 months later, on November 9th, 2003, the episode aired publicly for the first time on Cartoon Network's Adult Swim block, the same late-night program that had already been building a loyal audience for Family Guy reruns during the show's time away from Fox. It would take even longer for the episode to finally reach its original intended home. Fox did not broadcast the episode on its own network until December 10th, 2004, more than 4 years after it had first been written and finished. By that point, viewers watching it on Fox already knew the episode by reputation, since plenty of fans had already tracked it down through DVD sets or caught it during its Adult Swim airing the year before. Once people were finally able to sit down and watch the episode for themselves, the actual plot turned out to be built around a fairly simple setup wrapped in religious satire. The story begins with Peter losing money that Lois had been carefully saving, referred to in the show as her rainy day fund, after a scam artist convinces him to spend it on a completely pointless insurance policy protecting against volcano damage, despite the fact that Quahog is nowhere near an active volcano of any kind. With the family's savings gone, Peter becomes desperate to find a quick solution to his money troubles. He ends up praying, somewhat comically, for a Jewish person to come into his life and help him manage his finances, based on a stereotype that Jewish people are naturally skilled with money. This prayer, exaggerated and blunt, exactly the way Family Guy tends to write Peter's thought process, sets the entire plot in motion. Peter's prayer appears to work almost immediately, since he soon meets and befriends a Jewish accountant named Max Weinstein, voiced by Peter Peter Riegert. Max helps Peter get his financial situation back under control, and Peter becomes fascinated with Judaism as a result, convinced that the religion itself must be the secret ingredient behind Max's success with money. Rather than simply being thankful for the help, Peter takes the idea to an extreme conclusion that feels typical of his character throughout the show. He decides that if being Jewish helped Max succeed, converting his own son Chris to Judaism might guarantee that Chris grows up successful as well. This leads Peter to begin planning a bar mitzvah for Chris, a Jewish coming-of-age ceremony traditionally held for a boy once he turns 13, without much thought given to whether Chris actually wants to convert or whether the family has any real connection to the faith beyond Peter's shallow reasoning. One of the most memorable pieces of the episode comes in the form of a musical number called I Need a Jew, which Peter performs as a parody of the classic song When You Wish Upon a Star, the same song that gives the episode its title. The parody song leans directly into stereotypes about Jewish people and money, turning what is normally a gentle, hopeful Disney-style tune into something built around exaggerated jokes about greed and financial success tied to religion. The lyrics went even further than simple money jokes, including a line referencing Jewish people being blamed historically for the death of Jesus Christ, a reference to centuries-old religious prejudice that long predates the show itself. Putting a reference like that inside a cheerful-sounding parody song is exactly the kind of choice that made network executives nervous in the first place, since a joke built on centuries of real-world prejudice does not read the same way to every viewer, even when it is framed as mocking the people who hold that prejudice rather than mocking Jewish people themselves. As the episode moves toward its climax, Lois becomes aware of what Peter is planning and rushes to stop the ceremony before it can happen. She borrows Quagmire's car to get there in time, arriving just as the bar mitzvah ceremony is underway. When Lois interrupts, the members of the congregation become angry, believing she is insulting their religion rather than simply trying to stop her husband's confused scheme. The scene turns into a chase, with the congregation pursuing the Griffins out of the building. In a moment clearly referencing the interrupted wedding scene from the film The Graduate, the family locks the synagogue door using a large Star of David to block their pursuers and escape. The chase does not end there, since the Griffins then find themselves on a bus that happens to be full of nuns, who become upset with Peter for straying so far from his own Catholic upbringing in pursuit of another religion entirely. The nuns respond by attacking Peter with rulers, a classic and slightly old-fashioned image tied to strict religious school discipline, closing the episode on one more joke aimed at a different religious group entirely. Looking closely at how the episode built its jokes shows a pattern that shows up throughout much of Family Guy's history, even if it did not fully protect this particular episode from controversy. Peter is not just shown mocking Judaism from a place of superiority, he is shown as an ignorant, foolish outsider whose own religion, Catholicism, gets mocked just as harshly by the end of the episode, symbolized by nuns physically attacking him with rulers. Earlier in the episode, Peter even makes a comment tying his own Irish Catholic background to drinking, and to opposing certain groups being allowed to march in a parade, placing an unflattering stereotype on his own heritage in the same breath as his comments about Jewish people and money. This structure reflects an approach the show would repeat many times over the years, aiming jokes at multiple groups within a single episode rather than picking one target and staying there, an approach sometimes described as treating every group as fair game rather than singling out just one. Despite this pattern, the specific choice to build an entire song around Jewish stereotypes and to include a direct reference to a painful piece of religious history made this episode different from a quick-passing joke buried inside a busy episode packed with unrelated cutaways. A short reference tucked into a busy episode can pass by quickly, while a full musical number dedicated to a single stereotype forces the audience to sit with that idea for much longer, giving it more weight and more room to be interpreted as mean-spirited rather than simply absurd. Fox's decision to hold the episode back for years suggests the network itself worried that the joke had crossed from playful exaggeration into something with real potential to cause offense on a much larger scale than a typical cutaway gag. The controversy surrounding When You Wish Upon a Weinstein did not end once the episode finally aired years later. A second, completely separate legal issue emerged from the very song that had caused so much hesitation in the first place. In 2007, years after the episode had already reached television audiences on both Adult Swim and Fox, a music publishing company called Born Company filed a lawsuit against Fox, Seth MacFarlane, and several other parties connected to the show. Born Company owned the rights to the original song When You Wish Upon a Star, the classic tune most people recognize from Disney's Pinocchio. The lawsuit argued that the parody song I Need a Jew amounted to copyright infringement, claiming that turning their song into what the lawsuit described as an anti-Semitic version damaged the reputation and value of the original piece of music. This was not simply a request for money over unauthorized use. The lawsuit specifically argued that pairing their beloved, family-friendly song with lyrics built around religious stereotypes hurt the way people might think about the original tune going forward, tying financial and reputational harm together in one legal argument. The case moved through the court system over the following 2 years, with lawyers on both sides arguing over where the line falls between illegal copying and legally protected parody. Parody is generally generally given special protection under copyright law in the United States, based on the idea that taking a well-known piece of work and twisting it for comedic or critical purposes serves a different purpose than simply copying it to profit off the original without adding anything new. The entire case rested on whether a judge would view I Need a Jew as a true parody, making a point about stereotypes and prejudice, or as something closer to using a famous melody purely to shock and offend without enough creative transformation to earn legal protection. In 2009, the court ruled in favor of Fox and Seth MacFarlane, determining that the song qualified as a protected parody under fair use law. This ruling meant Bourne Company's case failed, and Fox did not have to pay damages or pull the episode from future distribution because of the lawsuit. The ruling gave Family Guy a piece of legal history that most other animated comedies never have to think about, becoming a real-world court case referenced afterward whenever discussions come up about how far a parody song is legally allowed to go before it crosses into copyright violation. Looking back at the entire arc of this episode, from its original production, through years of being held back by Fox, to its eventual airing and the lawsuit that followed even after it reached the public, shows just how much weight a single half-hour of a cartoon can carry once it touches on a sensitive subject. Most episodes of any television show simply air on schedule, get watched, get talked about for a week or two, and then fade into the background of a larger season. When You Wish Upon a Weinstein, instead, became something closer to a small piece of television history, remembered specifically for the unusual path it took to reach an audience, rather than purely for its jokes or its story. Fans looking back on it years later, once it had already built a reputation as the mysterious banned episode, sometimes found the actual content less shocking than they expected, since years of build-up and rumor had created an expectation of something far more extreme than a bar mitzvah storyline built around a father's confused financial worries. The choice Fox made with this episode also set an important precedent for how the network would handle future Family Guy episodes that touched on religion, prejudice, or other sensitive real-world topics. Once a network holds one episode back for years over concerns about stereotypes, it becomes far more likely that similar concerns will come up again with future episodes that push into equally sensitive territory. Rather than treating this as a one-time decision unique to a single bar mitzvah storyline, Fox's handling of When You Wish Upon a Weinstein became an early example of the specific kind of caution the network would show again years later, when an entirely different subject proved even harder to put on the air, one that had nothing to do with religion or money, and everything to do with a medical procedure most comedies avoid completely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That next episode would not spend years quietly sitting on a shelf waiting for the right moment to sneak onto Adult Swim before finally reaching Fox's own schedule. Instead, it would become the only episode in the entire history of the show that Fox refused to air on network television at any point at all, choosing instead to send it straight to a DVD release while keeping it permanently off the channel that had aired every other episode the Griffins had ever appeared in. Section 03, Partial Terms of Endearment. Every episode of Family Guy that Fox held back eventually found its way onto the network at some point, whether that took a few weeks, a few months, or in one case several years. Every episode, that is, except for one. Partial Terms of Endearment holds a place in the show's history that no other episode shares. It is the only episode of Family Guy that has never aired on Fox at any point since the show began in 1999. Not once. It never aired on Adult Swim either, the same late-night block that had already helped rescue the show once before by airing reruns and even a previously unaired episode during the years the show sat canceled. Instead, this episode went straight to a DVD release, becoming something fans could only watch by buying a physical copy rather than simply tuning in on a normal night of television. The episode was produced as part of the show's 8th season, finished and ready to go in 2010. By this point, Family Guy was firmly established, years removed from its 2 cancellations and its slow comeback through DVD sales and reruns. The show had already built a reputation for pushing into subjects other comedies avoided, having already dealt with religion directly in When You Wish Upon a Weinstein years earlier. Even with that history of controversy already behind it, this new episode dealt with a subject that proved to be a completely different level of sensitive. The topic was abortion, and the network's response to it showed just how differently that particular subject gets treated compared to almost anything else a comedy might try to joke about. The episode carries the title Partial Terms of Endearment, a play on the name of the well-known 1983 film Terms of Endearment, a drama about a mother and daughter dealing with major life changes and eventually illness. Swapping in the word partial gives a hint toward the subject matter without spelling it out directly, since the phrase partial birth abortion had become a common term used in political debates over abortion procedures during the years leading up to this episode. Even before a single scene played out, the title alone signaled that the episode planned to walk directly into one of the most heated debates in American politics, rather than tiptoeing around it with vague references. The story begins with Lois attending her college reunion, held at a school identified in the episode as Salve Regina College, based on a real school that actually changed its name to Salve Regina University back in 1991 after updating its official charter years before the episode ever aired. At the reunion, Lois runs into an old friend from her college years named named Naomi, who reveals that she and her husband have been struggling to have children of their own. Naomi asks Lois for an enormous favor, wondering whether Lois would be willing to act as a surrogate mother for them, carrying a pregnancy on their behalf using in vitro fertilization, a medical process where an egg and sperm are combined outside the body before being placed into the mother carrying the pregnancy. Lois agrees to help her old friend, setting the entire plot of the episode into motion. Peter is not thrilled about the idea from the very beginning, showing hesitation and discomfort with his wife carrying a pregnancy for someone else. Though his objections early in the episode come across more as classic Peter selfishness and confusion than any deep moral stance on pregnancy or medical procedures. After some back and forth arguing between Peter and Lois, the process moves forward anyway, and Lois becomes pregnant with the child that legally and biologically belongs to Naomi and her husband. Up to this point, the episode plays out almost like a fairly ordinary Family Guy storyline, built around an unusual family situation, mixing in the show's typical unrelated cutaway jokes and side stories the same way any other episode would. The story takes its serious turn when Naomi and her husband are killed in a car accident, while Lois is still pregnant with their child. This sudden and tragic development leaves Lois carrying a baby that no longer has any biological parents left alive to raise it, forcing her and Peter to figure out what happens next. The episode presents Lois with two paths forward. She could carry the pregnancy to full term and place the baby up for adoption once it is born, or she could choose to end the pregnancy through an abortion. Rather than rushing past this decision with a quick joke and moving on to something else, the episode slows down and treats this choice as the emotional center of the entire story, giving both Lois and Peter real space to react to what has happened and what they now have to decide. Peter's position throughout this part of the episode goes through a reversal that becomes one of the most talked about pieces of the entire story. Early in the debate, Peter actually leans towards supporting an abortion, seemingly driven by the simplest and most practical instinct that raising an unplanned, unwanted baby that is not biologically his own would be a massive disruption to his life. This alone stands out, since it runs against a common assumption that a comedy character written to represent an average, not especially thoughtful working-class dad would automatically take a strict anti-abortion position without ever considering it from another angle first. Peter's early stance shows the writers were not interested in giving him a simple, predictable political opinion straight out of the gate. Peter's position shifts dramatically after he is shown a video by anti-abortion protesters outside a clinic, a video designed to convince him that abortion amounts to taking a human life. After watching this video, Peter becomes firmly and passionately against the idea of Lois getting an abortion, taking his new position to an extreme that fits his character's usual habit of reacting to information with far more emotion and far less nuance than the situation calls for. He begins arguing with Lois about the rights of the unborn child and insisting she carry the pregnancy to term rather than end it, completely reversing the position he held only a short time earlier in the same episode. This reversal becomes an important piece of the episode's overall structure, since it shows Peter's opinion on a deeply serious topic being shaped entirely by whichever emotional appeal happened to reach him most recently, rather than by any stable belief system he had thought through on his own ahead of time. Lois, throughout this entire disagreement, is shown wrestling with the decision in a much more grounded and serious way than Peter's back-and-forth emotional swings. The episode gives her space to consider what carrying this pregnancy would actually mean for her own life and the life of her family, weighing the responsibility of raising a child that was never meant to be hers against the emotional and physical weight of ending a pregnancy she did not originally start for herself in the first place. After going through this internal struggle, and after continuing to push back against Peter's pressure, Lois ultimately decides to have the abortion. The episode does not treat this as a simple, easy decision made without any weight behind it. It is shown as the outcome of real deliberation on Lois's part, arrived at only after working through the situation from multiple angles rather than jumping straight to a conclusion the moment the tragedy struck. Around this central storyline, the episode still includes the kind of humor that runs through every other episode of the show, mixing serious subject matter with the same style of absurd jokes and unrelated tangents fans had already come to expect. Peter, at one point in the episode, becomes so worked up about the situation that he considers extreme actions, including a moment referenced by fans afterward, where Peter breaks the fourth wall and directly acknowledges that Lois would already know he is capable of doing something as extreme as attacking an abortion clinic himself, since she has, in his own words inside the show, seen Family Guy before and knows exactly what kind of person he tends to be within episodes like this one. Other side jokes scattered throughout the episode touch on completely unrelated topics, including a moment involving Meg dating a character based on Count Von Count, a well-known figure from the children's show Sesame Street, showing that even in an episode built around a topic this serious, the writers still worked in plenty of the show's usual unrelated comedy, rather than turning the entire half hour into a purely dramatic piece. Once the episode was completely finished, Fox made the decision not to broadcast it at all. This decision came directly from network leadership, and it was framed publicly less as a moral objection to the content itself and more as a practical business decision about risk. According to comments made afterward by a Fox executive involved in the decision, abortion stood out among every other other sensitive topic the show had ever tackled as the one subject most likely to cause real trouble for the network, regardless of how carefully or fairly the episode handled the debate on screen. That same executive reportedly acknowledged that the episode actually handled the subject matter well, giving both sides of the abortion debate real space to make their case through Peter and Lois's opposing positions, yet still concluded that airing it was simply not worth the potential backlash it could bring down on the network. This distinction matters, since it shows the decision to keep the episode off the air was not necessarily because Fox believed the episode itself was poorly made or unfair in how it presented the issue. It came down to a calculation about business risk tied to one of the most emotionally charged and politically divided topics in the entire country. This makes Partial Terms of Endearment different from When You Wish Upon a Weinstein in an important way. The Weinstein episode eventually aired everywhere, first on DVD, then on Adult Swim, and finally years later on Fox itself, meaning the delay was temporary even though it stretched on for years. Partial Terms of Endearment never received that same path forward. Fox held firm on keeping it off the network entirely, and even Adult Swim, the same outlet that had rescued the show during its years off Fox and had aired the previously unaired Weinstein episode without hesitation, chose not to air this one either after Fox requested that they avoid putting it on their schedule. This made the abortion episode uniquely permanent in its absence from television broadcast, standing apart from every other controversial episode the show had produced up to that point. Since Fox would not put the episode on television, the only way for fans to watch it became purchasing it directly. The episode was released as part of a DVD and Blu-ray collection on September 28, 2010, giving it a release strategy closer to something like a bonus feature or a special standalone release, rather than a normal episode airing as part of a full season on a fixed weekly schedule. This release included additional bonus content packaged alongside the episode itself, treating it almost like a special event rather than simply another entry in Season 8. Critics who reviewed the episode once it became available generally responded to it in a positive way, often noting a level of thoughtfulness that stood out compared to typical episodes of the show. One reviewer for the entertainment website IGN gave the episode a favorable score, specifically praising its willingness to tackle a subject as risky as abortion directly, something the reviewer noted plenty of networks would consider far too dangerous to broadcast under normal circumstances. That same reviewer pointed out that once viewers actually sat down and watched the finished episode, the humor and overall structure followed the same irreverent style fans already expected from the show, suggesting that some of the surrounding controversy about the episode's existence had grown larger than the actual content itself, once people finally got the chance to judge it directly, rather than reacting only to rumors about what it might contain. Other reactions from fans and casual viewers watching the episode after its release were more mixed, split between people who appreciated the episode's willingness to give a genuinely serious topic real weight within a comedy series, and people who felt the crude humor woven throughout the story clashed awkwardly with a topic this heavy. Some viewers argued the episode leaned too far into shock value purely for the sake of being edgy, without enough thoughtful commentary to justify tackling such a serious, real-world debate inside a cartoon comedy built primarily around jokes. Others pushed back against that criticism, arguing that presenting both a strong pro-life perspective through Peter's temporary position and a genuine, carefully considered pro-choice outcome through Lois's final decision actually gave the episode more balance than critics were willing to give it credit for, especially compared to how quickly most television comedies avoid the topic of abortion altogether, rather than attempting to explore it from more than one angle within a single story. The reason this particular episode drew such a firm and lasting response from Fox becomes clearer when placed next to everything the show had already survived by 2010. By this point, Family Guy had already dealt with religious stereotypes in the Weinstein episode, along with countless smaller controversial jokes scattered across cutaway gags in nearly every season since the show returned in 2005. None of those earlier controversies resulted in a full episode being permanently banned from network broadcast. Abortion proved to be different, treated by Fox as a subject far too politically and emotionally charged to risk putting in front of a live broadcast audience, no matter how the jokes were written or how fairly both sides of the debate were represented within the story itself. This distinction shows that not every sensitive topic carries equal weight in the eyes of a network making these kinds of decisions. Religion, stereotypes, and plenty of other touchy subjects had already found their way onto Fox's air, sometimes only after a long delay, but abortion specifically crossed a line that the network was simply not willing to step over at all. This episode also stands as a clear marker of just how far the show was willing to go creatively, even knowing ahead of time that a network broadcast might never happen. The writers and animators still put together a fully finished episode, complete with guest voice performances and the same production value as any other episode of the season, despite the very real possibility that Fox might choose never to air it. Committing that much time, money, and effort into an episode with such an uncertain future says something about how far the show's creative team was willing to push, even under the shadow of a network that had already shown, through the Weinstein episode years earlier, that it was capable of holding controversial material back for years at a time. Partial Terms of Endearment remains to this day Guy, the only episode in the entire history of Family Guy that has never appeared on broadcast television in the United States at any point since the show began. Every other controversial episode eventually found its way onto Fox's air, whether through a quick decision to air it as scheduled or through a long, delayed path similar to the one taken by the Weinstein episode. This one alone stayed permanently confined to home video, standing as the clearest example of a line that even a show known for pushing boundaries could not convince its own network to cross. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every controversial episode that followed dealt with a subject connected to religion, politics, or a serious medical decision like this one did. The next major controversy to hit the show turned its attention toward a completely different and much more personal kind of story, one built not around abortion or religious stereotypes, but around a member of Quagmire's own family revealing a truth about their identity that would upend everything Quagmire thought he understood about the person who raised him. Section 04, Quagmire's dad, Family Guy, had already shown by 2010 that it was willing to build entire episodes around subjects most comedies would never touch, having already faced down a network ban over an episode dealing with abortion just months apart from another episode that dug into a completely different kind of sensitive ground. This next episode did not deal with politics, religion, or a medical decision made between a husband and wife. Instead, it turned its attention toward one of its own long-running characters and the father who raised him, building a story around a family secret that changed how audiences saw Glenn Quagmire, one of the show's most consistently used side characters since the very first season. The episode was called Quagmire's Dad, and it aired on May 9th, 2010, as the 18th episode of the show's 8th season. Quagmire had appeared in the show since its earliest days, known mostly for his catchphrase and his constant, exaggerated pursuit of women, serving as one of Peter's closest friends alongside Joe in Cleveland. Despite years of episodes built around his personal life, very little had ever been shown or explained about his family background before this episode arrived. Quagmire's dad set out to fill in that gap by introducing his father, a retired Navy lieutenant commander named Dan, who arrives in Quahog to visit his son. Dan is shown early in the episode as exactly the kind of tough, respected military figure Quagmire has always looked up to, a decorated war hero from the Vietnam War whose reputation carries real weight with everyone who meets him, including Peter and the rest of the group. The story shifts almost immediately once Dan reveals the real reason for the visit. Dan tells Quagmire that he has decided to undergo gender confirmation surgery, a medical procedure that changes a person's physical body to align with their gender identity, and that going forward the character wishes to be known as a woman named Ida rather than as Dan. This revelation arrives with very little build-up inside the episode itself, dropped on both Quagmire and the audience as an abrupt piece of news right at the point where viewers had just finished being introduced to Dan as a proud, traditional military man. The surgery itself takes place off-screen and happens quickly within the episode's timeline, and once it is complete, Ida returns to the story already fully transitioned, appearing with a noticeably different physical appearance than Dan had before the surgery. Quagmire's reaction to this news becomes one of the central threads running through the rest of the episode. Rather than accepting the change right away, he struggles with the fact that the parent he had always looked up to as a strong, traditional war hero now presents an entirely different identity than the one Quagmire had built his own sense of pride around for his entire life. This tension gives the episode its emotional core, showing a son wrestling with a version of a parent he no longer fully recognizes, even while the show frames Ida herself as someone confident and at peace with the decision she has made about her own identity. Despite his early struggle, Quagmire does not stay distant from his parent for the entire episode, eventually moving towards supporting Ida rather than staying angry or embarrassed about the change. While Quagmire works through his own complicated feelings, the rest of the Griffin family responds to Ida with a mix of confusion and outright mockery, treating the situation as an easy target for jokes rather than something requiring any real sensitivity. Peter and Lois in particular are shown reacting to Ida's transition with comments and behavior that lean heavily into treating her identity as strange or laughable, a tone that carried through much of the episode's humor and later became one of the most criticized elements once the episode reached a wider audience. Ida herself is written to speak openly and bluntly about her own transition and her body, including moments where she discusses details about the surgery itself during a family dinner scene, a choice that added to the sense that the episode was leaning into shock value as much as it was attempting any kind of genuine, thoughtful storytelling about a parent coming out as transgender to an adult child. The most talked about moment in the entire episode, and the piece that ended up defining its reputation more than anything else in the story, involves Brian. Earlier in the episode, before Brian realizes who Ida really is, the two characters spend time together and end up sleeping together, unaware to Brian at the time that Ida is Quagmire's parent. Once Brian discovers the truth, learning that he had slept with someone who used to be Dan and is now Quagmire's transitioned parent, his reaction becomes intensely physical. Brian is shown vomiting for an extended stretch of the episode, a scene that stretches on for roughly 30 seconds of screen time, portrayed as a reaction of pure disgust once he learns Ida's full identity and history. This vomiting scene became the single most criticized moment connected to the entire episode once it aired and began drawing wider attention. The scene did not simply show a brief, quick reaction meant to land as a short punchline before the story moved on. Stretching the moment out for such an unusually long amount of time gave it far more weight than a passing joke, forcing viewers to sit with an extended depiction of revulsion tied directly to the discovery that Brian had been intimate with someone who is transgender. Critics who reviewed the episode after it aired pointed to this scene specifically as the moment where the episode's tone shifted from broad, typical Family Guy crudeness into something that felt, in the words used by some reviewers afterward, genuinely hateful rather than simply crude or tasteless in the show's usual style. Brian's dialogue during this stretch of the episode added another layer to the criticism that followed. At one point, Brian is shown confusing the word transgender with the term used for a convicted sex offender, comparing Ida's situation to someone who would need to notify a neighborhood after moving into a new area, a comparison that directly linked being transgender to being a dangerous criminal, despite the two having nothing to do with each other. This particular line drew significant backlash once critics and advocacy groups began responding publicly to the episode, since conflating a transgender identity with criminal behavior reinforced a harmful and inaccurate stereotype rather than simply mocking Brian's own ignorance as a character. The episode reaches its final confrontation once Quagmire learns that Brian slept with Ida before either of them fully understood who the other person was. Rather than processing this information calmly, Quagmire responds by physically attacking Brian, delivering a beating that closes out the episode on a violent note. Brian, throughout this entire situation, had not actually done anything wrong by most reasonable standards, since he had no knowledge of Ida's identity as Quagmire's parent at the time the two of them were together, and the encounter itself had been consensual on both sides. Despite this, the episode ends with Brian slamming the front door after a final exchange of insults with Quagmire, closing the story on a note of anger and physical violence rather than any kind of resolution or understanding between the two friends. Once Quagmire's dad aired, reactions came in quickly from multiple directions, and the responses split sharply depending on who was doing the reviewing. Some entertainment critics found things to praise within the episode, particularly around specific lines of dialogue and the performance choices made throughout. One reviewer for the entertainment website Digital Spy ranked the episode among the better entries in the show's history based purely on its comedic value, specifically highlighting a line delivered by Brian after being attacked by Quagmire, where Brian responds to the beating by bluntly stating that he had slept with Quagmire's father, a line the reviewer described as one of the funniest moments in the show's run-up to that point. Another critic, writing for the entertainment website IGN, noted enjoying elements of the episode despite the surrounding controversy, while a reviewer for the AV Club offered a more mixed take, specifically pointing out that certain scenes of mockery aimed at Ida crossed into territory that felt overly mean-spirited rather than simply comedic, standing out as some of the weaker material even within a show already known for pushing boundaries. The reaction from advocacy groups representing the transgender and broader LGBTQ community proved far less mixed. The organization GLAAD, a group focused specifically on monitoring and responding to media representation of LGBTQ people, issued public criticism of the episode, describing it as incredibly offensive to transgender people. This response came from an organization with direct experience tracking how transgender characters and storylines get handled across film and television, giving their criticism particular weight compared to a general audience reaction, since GLAAD's stated purpose involves specifically evaluating whether depictions like this one help or harm public understanding of transgender people in the real world. The Parents Television Council, a conservative advocacy group that had already criticized Family Guy repeatedly over the years for a wide range of content across many different episodes, also singled out Quagmire's dad for specific criticism once it aired. The organization named the episode its worst TV show of the week, a label the group had already applied to the series on numerous other occasions throughout its run. In this particular case, the council's criticism focused on a slightly different combination of complaints than GLAAD's, citing what the group described as an outrageously stereotyped portrayal of Ida, along with the extended vomiting scene and specific instances of sexual innuendo running throughout the episode. The council also pointed to a moment where Quagmire is shown experiencing a physical reaction while embracing Ida shortly after her transition, along with the violent ending between Quagmire and Brian, as further examples supporting their overall complaint about the episode's content. Having both an LGBTQ advocacy organization and a conservative watchdog group criticize the same episode, even while focusing on different specific complaints within it, showed just how widely the episode's content managed to draw negative attention from groups that rarely agreed with each other on anything else connected to the show. Seth MacFarlane, who wrote and voiced the character of Ida himself in addition to his regular voice work on the show, addressed the criticism directly not long after the episode aired. In an interview published in September of 2010 with the magazine Details, MacFarlane expressed genuine surprise at how negatively the episode had been received, specifically stating that he did not personally know many people within the gay community who reacted poorly to the episode, a comment that notably blurred the distinction between being transgender and being gay, two separate and distinct experiences that the episode itself had already shown some confusion confusion about through Brian's own dialogue earlier in the story. McFarlane went on to describe his intention behind the episode as creating what he called a very sympathetic portrayal of a transgender character, standing by that description even while acknowledging the strong reaction the episode had already generated by that point. McFarlane also directly defended the decision to include Brian's extended vomiting scene when addressing the interview's questions about the episode. He explained his reasoning by comparing Brian's reaction to how a heterosexual man might respond upon learning he had slept with someone who had undergone a gender transition, drawing a comparison to how a gay man might react with disgust toward a woman's body under similar circumstances of surprise. This explanation attempted to frame Brian's reaction as a believable, character-driven response tied to his specific sexual orientation, rather than as a broader statement about transgender people as a whole, though this explanation did little to change the minds of critics who had already objected to how much screen time the reaction had been given. Years later, well after the initial wave of criticism had faded, McFarlane revisited the topic of Quagmire's dad publicly once again. In a 2022 interview, over a decade after the episode had originally aired, McFarlane continued to stand behind the episode, maintaining that he still believed it presented a sympathetic take on a transgender character, despite the ongoing criticism the episode continued to receive from viewers and critics revisiting it years after its original broadcast. This continued defense showed that McFarlane's view of the episode had not shifted significantly over time, even as broader public understanding and media representation of transgender people had changed considerably in the years between the episode's original airing and his later comments on it. Looking at Quagmire's dad next to the two episodes covered earlier in this look at Family Guy's most controversial moments reveals a clear difference in how this particular controversy played out compared to the others. The Weinstein episode drew concern specifically from Fox's own internal standards process before it ever reached the public, leading to a multi-year delay before eventually airing everywhere the show normally appeared. Partial terms of endearment drew a permanent ban from broadcast television entirely, based on a network's own calculation of political and business risk rather than direct criticism from outside advocacy groups following its release. Quagmire's Dad took a different path altogether, airing exactly on its original scheduled date without any network hesitation or delay, only to draw significant backlash afterward from advocacy organizations representing the very community the episode's central storyline focused on. This episode shows that not every controversy connected to the show came from cautious network executives working behind the scenes before broadcast. Sometimes the backlash arrived only after millions of people had already watched the episode play out exactly as its writers intended, with the public reaction itself becoming the entire story rather than any decision made quietly inside a network office beforehand. The episode also reveals something specific about how the show tended to handle stories built around identity and personal transformation during this period of its run. Rather than centering the story primarily on Ida's own internal experience, or her relationship with her son from her own point of view, the episode leaned heavily on the reactions of the people around her, using Quagmire's discomfort, Brian's disgust, and Peter and Lois's mockery as the primary sources of humor throughout the story. This structure placed the burden of the episode's comedy almost entirely on how other characters responded to Ida's identity, rather than on anything specific to her own experience or personality beyond her military background and her bluntness about her own body. This particular approach to writing a transgender character became one of the most consistent points of criticism raised by reviewers and advocacy groups alike, regardless of whether they focused more on the show's treatment of stereotypes or its handling of specific jokes and scenes throughout the episode. Quagmire's Dad remains one of the most frequently cited examples whenever conversations come up about Family Guy's history with sensitive subject matter, standing apart from episodes focused on religion, politics, or medical decisions by instead placing its controversy directly on the personal identity of a character connected to one of the show's own long-running cast members. The episode aired without any network resistance, reached its full audience exactly as written, and only afterward became the subject of ongoing debate that has continued to resurface in discussions about the show for well over a decade since its original broadcast. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every controversial episode Family Guy produced dealt with a subject rooted in personal identity or family relationships. The next episode, covered in this look at the show's history, moved away from questions of gender and family secrets entirely, instead drawing directly from a real-world news story that had gripped the entire country only a few years before the episode itself went into production, turning an ongoing national debate about race and self-defense into a storyline built around one of Peter's own closest friends, and a mistake that could not be undone once the trigger had already been pulled. Section 05, A Shot in the Dark. By the time Family Guy reached its 14th season, the show had already spent years building a track record of episodes that drew criticism, ranging from religious stereotypes to a permanently banned storyline about abortion to a family secret that upset advocacy groups on more than one side of an ongoing cultural debate. None of those earlier controversies, however, involved pulling directly from a real news story that had dominated headlines across the entire country only a few years earlier. That changed with an episode episode called A Shot in the Dark, which aired on December 13th, 2015, as the 9th episode of the show's 14th season. This episode built its entire plot around a storyline that closely mirrored the real-life shooting of a Florida teenager named Trayvon Martin, a case that had already sparked national protests, heated political debate, and a closely watched criminal trial years before this episode ever went into production. The real-world case that inspired the episode took place in February of 2012, when a neighborhood watch volunteer named George Zimmerman shot and killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in a gated community in Florida. Zimmerman claimed he acted in self-defense after a confrontation with Martin, and he was later charged with murder, leading to a trial that captured national attention throughout 2013. Zimmerman was ultimately acquitted, a verdict that triggered widespread protests and became a major flashpoint in ongoing conversations about race, gun laws, and how neighborhood watch groups operate across the country. The case also brought national attention to a Florida law commonly referred to as a Stand Your Ground law, which allows a person to use force in self-defense without first needing to attempt retreating from a dangerous situation, a legal detail that became central to Zimmerman's defense during his trial. Family Guy's writers built A Shot in the Dark using this real case as a clear template, even going so far as to originally title the episode Stand Your Brown during its production process, a direct play on the Stand Your Ground law combined with the surname of one of the show's long-running characters, Cleveland Brown. The episode eventually aired under the different title A Shot in the Dark, though the connection to the Zimmerman case remained obvious in the finished plot, regardless of the title change. The story begins with Peter's couch getting stolen from his front lawn, a theft that leaves him frustrated and eager to do something about crime in his neighborhood. Rather than simply reporting the theft to the police and moving on, Peter decides to form a neighborhood watch group along with his usual group of friends, including Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire. The group, described within the show as the Beer Bar Buddies, obtains firearms and begins actively patrolling the streets of the neighborhood at night, positioning themselves as a kind of informal protection service meant to prevent further theft or crime in the area. While out on patrol one night, Peter spots a shadowy figure attempting to enter a house through a window rather than through the front door. Believing he has caught an intruder in the act of breaking into the home, Peter draws his firearm and orders the figure to stop. When the person does not immediately respond the way Peter expects, Peter fires his weapon, shooting the figure in the arm. Only after the shooting does Peter discover the identity of the person he just shot. The figure turns out to be Cleveland Jr., the teenage son of Peter's friend Cleveland Brown, who had been trying to enter his own home through the window rather than the front door, specifically to avoid letting cold or warm air escape through the front entrance depending on the weather at the time. Cleveland Jr. explains afterward that he did not hear Peter's warning because he had been listening to music through headphones at the time of the shooting, meaning the entire incident stemmed from a case of mistaken identity and a simple failure to communicate rather than any deliberate act of violence or hatred on Peter's part. The fallout from the shooting becomes the central focus of the rest of the episode. Once news of the shooting spreads, Cleveland and his wife Donna respond with shock and anger, and the situation quickly escalates beyond a simple accident between two friends. Cleveland and Donna begin describing what happened to their son as a hate crime, framing the shooting as an act motivated by racial bias rather than as a tragic misunderstanding caused by darkness, distance, and Peter's own carelessness in handling a firearm during his neighborhood patrol. Peter finds himself formally charged with a hate crime as a direct result of the incident, moving the story from a personal dispute between two families into a full legal case that plays out through much of the rest of the episode. The episode addresses the racial elements of the story directly, rather than avoiding them, showing Peter struggling to understand why an accident he insists had nothing to do with race is being treated as a deliberate act of racism. At one point during the episode, Peter even comes up with the idea of painting his own skin to appear as though he is black, apparently believing this would somehow prove to others that he does not hold racist views. Lois reacts to this idea with immediate and intense anger, physically striking Peter with a magazine before he can go through with the plan, a moment the episode uses to make clear that even within the story itself, Peter's own attempt at addressing the situation is treated as deeply misguided rather than something the show is holding up as a reasonable solution. As the case moves toward a courtroom setting, Peter receives legal help from a family member named Carter, Lois's wealthy father, who has appeared in earlier seasons of the show as a recurring character known for his blunt, often harsh opinions. Carter agrees to help clear Peter's name, but the episode makes clear that his motivation for helping has nothing to do with a genuine belief that Peter acted fairly, or that race played no role in how people were reacting to the situation. Instead, Carter is shown holding openly prejudiced views himself, seeing no real problem with the idea of an armed man shooting an unarmed black teenager, and choosing to help Peter partly out of family loyalty rather than any concern about justice or fairness in how the case unfolds. Carter's strategy for winning the case involves shifting blame onto Cleveland Jr. himself, portraying him in court as a violent and dangerous individual rather than as the innocent teenager who had simply been trying to get into his own home. This tactic ultimately succeeds in clearing Peter of the charges against him, but it does so by damaging Cleveland Jr.'s reputation situation in the process, a resolution that trades one form of unfairness for another rather than offering any kind of clean or satisfying answer to the situation the episode had built up over its runtime. Once the legal situation reaches its conclusion, Peter is shown finally taking responsibility for his own actions rather than continuing to insist that the entire situation was blown out of proportion. In a moment near the end of the episode, Cleveland, moved by Peter finally admitting fault, makes an unusual decision of his own. Rather than accepting an apology and simply moving on, Cleveland falsely claims in public that he was the one who shot his own son, taking the blame onto himself in an attempt to end the ongoing conflict between the two families. This false confession leads to an unexpected reaction from the surrounding crowd of onlookers, who lose interest in the situation entirely once they believe the shooting involved one black family member harming another rather than an outside party being involved. The crowd disperses without further concern, a moment the episode uses to comment on the idea that public and media attention toward violence tends to shift dramatically, depending on who is involved, specifically referencing the argument that incidents described at the time as violence occurring within a single racial community often receive far less sustained attention than incidents involving people of different racial backgrounds. The episode closes with Cleveland Jr. warning Peter that he plans to seek revenge for what happened to him, despite the surrounding legal case having already concluded and despite Cleveland's own effort to smooth things over by falsely taking the blame himself. This ending leaves the relationship between Peter and the Brown family notably unresolved, closing the episode on a tense note rather than wrapping the entire situation up with the kind of clean reconciliation more typical of a standard sitcom storyline. Even before the episode reached television screens, real-world events outside the show's control ended up affecting exactly when audiences finally saw it. The episode had originally been scheduled to air on November 15, 2015. Just 2 days before that planned air date, a series of coordinated terrorist attacks took place in Paris, France on November 13, 2015, killing well over 100 people and dominating news coverage across the entire world in the days that followed. Given the timing, the network chose to delay the episode's broadcast, replacing it that week with a different episode called Peter's Sister instead. A new air date was then set for December 13, 2015, but even that date fell shortly after another major violent event, a mass shooting that took place in San Bernardino, California on December 2, 2015. Despite this second tragedy occurring so close to the newly scheduled air date, the network moved forward with airing A Shot in the Dark on December 13th as planned, choosing not to delay the episode a second time even though its central plot revolved directly around a shooting. Once the episode finally aired, reactions from critics and audiences were largely negative, standing out even among a show that had already built years of experience handling backlash from earlier controversial episodes. Unlike some of the show's previous controversial episodes, which drew praise from at least some critics even amid larger controversy, A Shot in the Dark received criticism that focused heavily on the argument that the episode simply failed to handle its subject matter with enough intelligence or care. One entertainment writer, reviewing the episode shortly after it aired, argued that the show had not been consistently funny for close to a decade by that point, and suggested that this decline in comedic quality made the episode's attempt at tackling a topic this serious land even worse than it might have otherwise. That same reviewer pointed specifically to the storyline's focus on how the shooting affected Peter emotionally, arguing that centering so much of the episode's attention on Peter's discomfort rather than on the deeper issues raised by the real-world case it was clearly based on came across as a missed opportunity rather than a thoughtful piece of satire. Criticism of the episode also focused heavily on the ending sequence involving Cleveland's false confession and the crowd's reaction to it. Some critics argued that this ending relied on a deeply cynical and reductive assumption about how the public and media respond differently depending on the racial dynamics involved in a given act of violence, suggesting that the joke oversimplified a complicated and serious topic into a punchline that let the underlying tension of the episode deflate too easily rather than confronting it directly. Other critics took a different view entirely, arguing that the episode's decision to reveal the shooting as a genuine accident rather than an act driven by racial bias actually served as a pointed criticism of how quickly people can be labeled as racist based on assumptions made in the heat of a tense and confusing situation. Under this reading, the episode was seen less as a poorly handled joke about a real tragedy and more as an argument against jumping to conclusions about a person's motivations without first understanding the full context of what actually happened. Fan reaction to the episode, visible in discussions taking place online in the years following its original broadcast, showed a similarly divided response split roughly along the same lines as professional critics. Some fans expressed frustration with how quickly the episode turned Cleveland against Peter, arguing that after years of friendship shown across the entire series, it felt unrealistic and abrupt for Cleveland to immediately assume the worst about Peter's motivations the moment the shooting occurred, rather than giving him any benefit of the doubt based on their long history together. Other viewers focused their criticism specifically on how harshly the episode portrayed Cleveland and Donna's response to the incident, arguing that the storyline unfairly played what some fans described as an easy racial angle, rather than allowing the situation to be explored with more nuance. A separate group of viewers responded more favorably to the episode specifically because of this same storyline element, appreciating what they saw as a pointed message pushing back against what they considered an overly quick rush to label an honest mistake as a deliberate act of racism. Placing A Shot in the Dark next to the earlier controversial episodes covered in this look at the show's history reveals a distinct difference in where this particular controversy originated. The Weinstein episode and Partial Terms of Endearment both drew their initial controversy from decisions made internally by the network, choosing to delay or permanently withhold episodes based on anticipated public reaction before most viewers had ever actually seen the finished product. Quagmire's Dad aired exactly as scheduled, drawing backlash only after the fact from advocacy groups reacting to specific content once the episode had already reached its full audience. A Shot in the Dark followed a path closer to the Quagmire's Dad model, airing on its rescheduled date without the network permanently pulling it from broadcast. Yet the criticism it received afterward carried a different weight entirely, since it drew directly from an ongoing and deeply painful real-world case that had already caused significant grief and division across the country, well before the show ever turned it into a storyline involving Peter, Cleveland, and a stolen couch. This episode also stands apart from the earlier controversies in another important way. The Weinstein episode dealt with a stereotype rooted in historical prejudice that stretched back centuries, and Quagmire's Dad dealt with an identity-related storyline that touched on ongoing cultural debates without being tied to one specific, widely known news event. A Shot in the Dark instead based its entire plot on a case that had a real victim, a real family, and a real legal outcome that had already played out fully in the public eye only a few years before the episode aired. Turning a case this specific and this recent into a comedy storyline carried a different kind of risk than the show's earlier controversial episodes, since audiences watching the episode were not being asked to laugh at a general stereotype or a hypothetical family situation. They were being asked to watch a fictionalized, comedic version of events closely tied to a real death that had already shaped major national conversations about race and self-defense laws in the years immediately before the episode reached television screens. A Shot in the Dark closed out its story with more loose ends left hanging than most of the other episodes covered so far in this look at the show's history, with Cleveland Jr.'s threat of revenge against Peter left completely unresolved by the time the credits rolled. This open ending reflected the same uncertainty that had surrounded so much of the real-world case the episode had drawn from in the first place, where a legal verdict had settled the criminal case itself without doing much to settle the broader national argument the case had sparked in the years that followed. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every controversial storyline Family Guy produced dealt with violence, legal trouble, or events pulled from national news coverage. The next episode covered in this look at the show's most talked about moments turned toward a much quieter and more personal kind of pain, one built entirely around a woman trapped in an abusive relationship, a brother desperate to save her, and an ending that pushed the show into territory far more serious than almost anything it had attempted up to that point. Section 06, Screams of Silence. The story of Brenda Q. Family Guy had already spent years building a reputation for turning painful subjects into comedy, but most of those subjects stayed at a certain distance from the show's core cast. Religion, politics, and a real-world shooting case had all been filtered through storylines that mostly kept the emotional weight on side characters or brief plot points. That changed on October 30th, 2011, when the show aired the third episode of its 10th season, titled Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. This episode brought domestic violence directly into the extended Griffin family circle, built around Quagmire's own sister and a boyfriend whose cruelty toward her became one of the most uncomfortable storylines the show had produced up to that point. The episode was written by Alec Sulkin, a longtime writer for the series who had also worked on other notable episodes, and it was directed by Dominic Bianchi, who had previously directed one of the show's more dramatic outings, an episode centered on a serious conversation between Brian and Stewie. The episode also featured a guest performance from actress Caitlin Olsen, who voiced the character of Brenda Quagmire, Glenn Quagmire's sister, introduced here for the first time despite Quagmire having appeared in the show since its earliest seasons. It aired as part of an animated programming block on Fox that night, following The Simpsons and a premiere episode of a short-lived animated series called Alan Gregory, and it was followed immediately afterward by The Cleveland Show, a spin-off series that Seth MacFarlane had also created. According to Nielsen ratings figures from that night, the episode drew close to 6 million viewers, a solid number for the time slot despite competing directly against other programming that evening. The episode opens with an unrelated storyline involving Quagmire himself, who is shown recovering in a hospital after nearly dying from a dangerous act he attempted alone at home, an act that briefly cut off his air supply and left him unconscious before he was found and rushed to receive medical treatment. While Quagmire recovers, his sister Brenda arrives to help take care of him, singing him a childhood nursery rhyme that eventually helps bring him back to consciousness. This opening sequence, strange and dark as it is, mostly serves to introduce Brenda to the audience and establish a caring, protective bond between the siblings before the episode shifts its focus toward the actual subject the story wants to explore. Once Brenda is established as a caring presence in Quagmire's life, the episode begins revealing details about her own relationship with a boyfriend named Jeff. As the story continues, the audience learns that Jeff has been physically and emotionally abusing Brenda throughout their relationship. This becomes clear to Lois during a scene at a restaurant, where she notices that Brenda has been wearing sunglasses indoors and eventually discovers that Brenda is hiding a black eye underneath them. When Lois confronts her about it, Brenda responds by defending Jeff rather than acknowledging the abuse for what it is, insisting that he is a good person despite what has clearly happened to her. This pattern, where Brenda continually makes excuses for Jeff's behavior rather than accepting the reality of her situation, becomes one of the defining features of her character throughout the entire episode. News of the abuse eventually reaches Quagmire, Peter, and Joe during a conversation at their usual hangout spot, a bar called the Drunken Clam. Quagmire expresses real fear that Jeff might eventually kill his sister if nothing changes, showing a level of genuine concern that stands out against the more typical, exaggerated emotional reactions the show usually gives its characters. Joe, who works as a police officer in Quahog, explains that the police are unable to step in and arrest Jeff unless Brenda herself files an official complaint against him, a detail that reflects how domestic violence cases often require the victim to take formal legal action before authorities can intervene directly. Since Brenda has shown no willingness to take that step on her own, Joe suggests that the group hold an intervention instead, gathering people close to Brenda together in an attempt to convince her to leave the relationship before things get any worse. The intervention scene that follows does not go smoothly. Rather than offering thoughtful, supportive guidance, several characters make comments that undercut the seriousness of the moment, including a suggestion from Meg that Brenda simply change her behavior to avoid upsetting Jeff, placing responsibility on Brenda's own actions rather than on Jeff's choice to be violent toward her. This kind of misguided advice reflects a real pattern that can occur around domestic violence situations, where people close to a victim sometimes focus on what the victim could change rather than addressing the abuser's behavior directly, even when their intentions are meant to be helpful. As the episode continues, Jeff's behavior grows increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. At one point, he becomes enraged after seeing Brenda and Quagmire share an innocent hug between siblings, mistakenly assuming that something inappropriate is happening between them, a moment that shows just how far his jealousy and controlling behavior have already spread beyond simple arguments. Joe overhears Jeff assaulting Brenda from inside Quagmire's own house at one point, immediately recognizing the sound for what it is and rushing to respond. As tensions build across the episode, the group's concern shifts from simply trying to talk Brenda into leaving the relationship toward a much darker and more permanent solution. Rather than continuing to rely on legal channels or ongoing conversations, Peter, Quagmire, and Joe eventually decide that the only way to guarantee Brenda's safety is to kill Jeff themselves. The episode follows through on this decision rather than pulling back from it at the last moment. Quagmire ends up chasing Jeff down using his car after finding him threatening to harm himself with a shotgun, ultimately running him over and killing him in the process. Rather than allowing Brenda to learn the truth about what happened to Jeff, the group decides to fake a letter, writing it out as though Jeff had chosen to leave Brenda on his own, claiming in the fake note that he realized she deserved better than him and that he was leaving for her own good along with the unborn child she was carrying, since Brenda had become pregnant with Jeff's baby at some point before the events of the episode. The letter even includes a threatening postscript, written to make it sound as though Jeff had warned Brenda to tell anyone who asked that Joe, Peter, and Quagmire had been with her the entire previous night, covering for the fact that the three men had actually been out killing him during that exact window of time. Brenda, upon reading the fake letter and believing Jeff has simply abandoned her, breaks down in tears, mourning the loss of a relationship that had actually been endangering her life the entire time. The episode closes on this note of grief rather than relief, with Brenda shown crying over Jeff's supposed departure, while the men responsible for his actual death stand nearby, having successfully covered up what really happened to him. In the final moment of the episode, Peter comments that he now wishes he could kill someone else as well, immediately turning his attention toward a different recurring character named Mort Goldman, closing the episode on one more dark joke rather than any kind of resolution focused on Brenda's healing or her future safety. Once the episode aired, reactions split sharply between viewers who saw it as a bold, unusually serious piece of storytelling for a comedy series, and viewers who felt the show had badly mishandled a topic far too serious to be turned into entertainment in this way. Some critics praised the episode specifically for tackling domestic violence directly rather than avoiding it entirely, noting that very few animated comedies had ever attempted to build a full episode around this subject with this much seriousness woven throughout the story. The dramatic tone carried through much of the episode, especially in scenes involving Quagmire's fear for his sister's safety, stood out as unusually heartfelt for a series better known for absurd cutaway jokes and rapid-fire gags rather than sustained emotional weight. Other reactions focused much more heavily on criticism, particularly particularly from viewers who felt that combining domestic violence with the show's usual style of comedy created a deeply uncomfortable mix rather than a thoughtful examination of a serious issue. Some viewers who had personally experienced domestic violence in their own lives described the episode as painful to watch, arguing that turning scenes of Brenda being beaten into moments meant to generate laughs trivialized an experience that carries real and lasting trauma for people who have actually lived through it. This criticism did not focus on whether the topic itself should have been off-limits entirely, since other dramas and even some comedies had explored domestic violence in serious ways before. The specific complaint centered on the choice to blend that seriousness with jokes threaded throughout the same scenes, creating a tone that many viewers found jarring rather than balanced. A significant part of the criticism aimed at this episode also focused on its title and what many viewers saw as a mismatch between that title and the actual content of the story. The phrase "screams of silence" typically refers to abuse that happens secretly, hidden from view, with victims suffering quietly without anyone around them noticing or stepping in to help. This episode did the opposite of that pattern almost entirely. Jeff's abuse toward Brenda happens openly, witnessed directly by multiple characters throughout the episode, including Joe overhearing an assault from a neighboring house and Lois discovering physical evidence of abuse during a public outing at a restaurant. Since so many people around Brenda were already fully aware of what was happening to her, some critics argued that the title itself worked against the story the episode was actually telling, since nothing about the abuse in this particular case remained silent or hidden from the people who could have intervened much earlier. The ending of the episode drew its own specific wave of criticism, separate from concerns about the overall tone or the title. Rather than having Brenda learn the truth about Jeff's death and begin any kind of honest process of understanding what had happened to her, the episode instead has the men in her life deceive her completely, allowing her to grieve a version of events that never actually happened. Some viewers found this ending deeply troubling, arguing that instead of empowering Brenda to take control of her own situation, the story removed her agency entirely, having other people make every major decision about her safety and her understanding of events without her knowledge or consent at any point in the process. Rather than closing the episode with Brenda finding her own strength or clarity about what had happened to her, the story leaves her comforted by a lie constructed entirely by the men around her, which many critics felt undercut whatever seriousness the episode had built up until that point. This particular episode stands apart from every other controversial storyline covered in this look at Family Guy's history for one specific reason. Every other episode discussed so far dealt with controversy connected to a real-world event, a religious or cultural group, or a personal identity issue involving a specific character's background. This episode instead built its entire controversy around tone itself. Specifically, the decision to place a genuinely serious and painful subject inside a story that never fully committed to leaving behind the show's usual joke-driven structure. The controversy here did not center on whether the show had the right to explore domestic violence as a topic. It centered on whether mixing that subject with the show's normal comedic tone, including a joke-filled fake letter and Peter's closing line about wanting to kill someone else, undermined the seriousness the story seemed to be reaching for throughout its first half. Years after the episode originally aired, its ending took on an even heavier weight once later seasons of the show revealed new information about Brenda's fate. In a much later episode from the show's 18th season, Brenda appears again briefly in a scene set in the afterlife, shown alongside other characters from the series who have died over the course of the show's run. This brief appearance strongly suggests that Brenda died at some point between the events of this episode, and that later appearance, though the show never directly explains how or when her death occurred. This detail, revealed years after the original broadcast, added an unplanned layer of tragedy to a story that had already ended on an unresolved and unsettling note, since it suggests that removing Jeff from her life through murder and deception may not have actually protected Brenda in the long run the way the men around her had intended. Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q, remains one of the most frequently discussed dramatic outliers in the entire history of Family Guy, remembered less for a single controversial joke or a specific stereotype, and more for the uneasy balance it attempted to strike between real emotional weight and the show's usual comedic instincts. It showed that the series was willing to step outside its typical structure entirely for a full episode, even while struggling to fully commit to the seriousness that subject demanded once the story reached its final scenes. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every controversial episode Family Guy produced dealt with violence hidden behind closed doors, or a national news story already familiar to audiences before the episode aired. The next chapter in this look at the show's most talked about moments turns toward an entirely different kind of controversy. One built not around a family tragedy, but around a figure worshipped by billions of people worldwide. Reimagined by the show in a way that left an entire religious community with strong feelings about how their faith had just been portrayed on screen. Section 07, the 2,000-year-old virgin Family Guy, had already spent over a decade taking aim at religion by the time it produced an episode built entirely around Jesus Christ trying to lose his virginity. The show had poked at Judaism through an entire episode years earlier, and smaller jokes touching on Christianity had appeared scattered throughout many other seasons. None of those show's earlier moments match the direct, sustained focus of this particular episode, which placed Jesus himself at the center of an entire half-hour, built around sex, deception, and a running joke about his living arrangement. The episode was called The 2,000-Year-Old Virgin, and it aired on December 7, 2014, as the 6th episode of the show's 13th season and the 237th episode of the series overall. The episode was written by Ted Jessup and directed by Joseph Lee, airing as one of the show's regular Christmas-themed episodes, a tradition the series had followed several times before with other holiday-centered stories. Before the episode even reached television screens, the show's own production team had already anticipated the reaction it would receive. In an interview with Entertainment Weekly published ahead of the start of the 13th season, executive producer Steve Callahan was asked directly whether the upcoming Jesus episode would provoke backlash. Callahan responded by acknowledging that the episode itself contained a joke addressing that exact concern, admitting that the writers already expected the material to bother some portion of the audience once it aired. This kind of upfront acknowledgement from someone directly involved in making the episode shows that the writers were not blindsided by the criticism that eventually followed. They understood ahead of time exactly what kind of reaction a storyline like this would likely generate among religious viewers. The episode opens with Peter and Lois out shopping at the Quahog Mall before Christmas, where they unexpectedly run into Jesus. Rather than treating this encounter as some rare, miraculous event, the show presents it casually, as though Jesus is simply another resident of Quahog who happens to be out doing errands during the holiday season. This version of Jesus is shown living a lonely, unremarkable life, staying in Quahog because he feels uncomfortable dealing with his home life with God, suggesting a strained or awkward relationship between Jesus and his father that the episode never fully explains beyond this passing reference. Peter invites Jesus back to his own place after seeing that Jesus lives alone in what the show describes as a depressing bachelor apartment, a detail meant to reinforce just how ordinary and joyless his day-to-day existence has become. As Peter gets to know Jesus better over the course of the episode, he decides to invite him out for a night with his usual group of friends, including Quagmire, Cleveland, and Joe. During this outing, the group begins planning what to do for Jesus' upcoming birthday, a detail that plays on the fact that Christmas itself is traditionally treated as a celebration of Jesus' birth. While discussing the kinds of things Jesus might enjoy for his birthday celebration, the group is stunned to learn that despite being 2,000 years old, Jesus has never actually had sex with anyone. Rather than treating this revelation with any kind of reverence or respect toward Jesus as a religious figure, the group instead treats it the same way they might react to hearing that any other friend their age had never been in a relationship, deciding almost immediately that the best gift they can give him for his birthday is help losing his virginity. The group follows through on this plan, and Jesus eventually sets his sights on a woman to pursue as part of the effort to end his long stretch of celibacy. In a turn that becomes central to the episode's most controversial content, the woman Jesus decides to pursue turns out to be Lois herself. Rather than treating this as some kind of shocking violation, the episode frames it initially as though Jesus has simply convinced both Peter and Lois to go along with the idea, apparently securing agreement from both of them to allow the encounter to happen. As the story develops further, it becomes clear that this is not a one-time impulsive decision on Jesus' part, but rather part of an established pattern of behavior he has repeated many times before. The episode reveals that sleeping with a married woman once a year, after convincing her husband to allow it in exchange for gifts or persuasion, has apparently become something of an annual routine for this version of Jesus, turning what initially appeared to be a spontaneous romantic pursuit into a long-running, calculated scheme he has clearly used successfully on other unsuspecting couples before reaching the Griffins. Once Peter realizes what is actually happening and understands that Jesus' approach toward Lois follows this established pattern rather than being some genuine, sincere connection, he rushes to stop things before they go any further. Racing to reach the hotel where Jesus and Lois are staying, Peter arrives only to discover that no infidelity actually took place. Lois, on her own, had already decided that her marriage to Peter meant too much to risk on an encounter like this, choosing to turn Jesus down before anything happened between them. Rather than acknowledging that his attempted scheme had simply failed this time around, Jesus instead spins the entire situation into something resembling a moral lesson, praising Peter and Lois for what he frames as their strength in resisting temptation, effectively turning his own failed attempt at seduction into a story about testing their marriage's strength rather than admitting he had been caught trying to take advantage of the situation. Jesus then slips away from the Griffins, leaving them to continue celebrating their Christmas together while he moves on without any real consequence for what he had attempted. Once the episode aired, criticism arrived quickly from viewers who found its portrayal of Jesus deeply offensive on religious grounds. The core of this criticism centered on how directly the episode contradicted well-known Christian religious teachings while still presenting its version of events within a framework that treated Jesus as an actual, real depiction of the religious figure rather than as a clearly separate, fictional parody character unconnected to genuine Christian belief. One of the 10 Commandments found in Christian teaching specifically prohibits committing committing adultery, describing it as a serious moral violation. This episode, by directly showing its version of Jesus repeatedly sleeping with married women on an annual basis, portrayed a central figure of the Christian faith as guilty of exactly the kind of behavior that faith explicitly identifies as wrong. Critics pointed out that this created an uncomfortable contradiction within the show's own storytelling, since the episode's version of Jesus was shown committing the very sin his own religious teachings condemn, all while facing no meaningful consequences for that behavior by the time the episode reached its ending. The criticism extended beyond the adultery storyline itself and into how the episode chose to portray Jesus' overall personality and character. Rather than presenting him as a figure worthy of any kind of reverence, even within the exaggerated comedic world the show typically builds its characters around, the episode depicted Jesus as manipulative and deceptive, willing to trick both Peter and other unnamed husbands over the years into allowing him access to their wives through some combination of persuasion, bribery, or outright lying. Critics argued that framing an important religious figure this way went beyond simple, lighthearted mockery and moved into territory that felt disrespectful toward an entire faith built around reverence for that same figure. For many Christian viewers, watching a widely worshipped religious figure reduced to a con artist chasing married women during a holiday episode built specifically around Christmas felt like a direct and pointed insult rather than harmless comedy. The episode's own title added another layer to the criticism it received once viewers had a chance to watch the full story unfold. The 2,000-year-old virgin implies through its very name that the entire episode centers on Jesus' status as someone who has never had sex, framing his virginity as the driving detail behind the entire story. Once the plot actually plays out, however, the episode reveals that Jesus is not really a virgin trying to lose his virginity for the first time at all. The storyline instead reveals that he has an established pattern of infidelity stretching back through many previous years, meaning the entire premise suggested by the title turns out to be misleading once compared against what actually happens within the story itself. Some critics pointed to this mismatch as evidence that the episode had been built more around a provocative-sounding title designed to generate attention and controversy before it even aired, rather than being built around a genuinely consistent or well-thought-out storyline that matched what the title promised viewers ahead of time. Not every reaction to the episode came from a place of pure criticism. Some viewers and critics defended the episode by pointing to the show's long-standing pattern of mocking religious figures and institutions across many different faiths, rather than singling out Christianity specifically for this kind of treatment. Family Guy had already produced entire episodes making fun of Judaism through storylines built around stereotypes and parody songs, and other episodes throughout the show's run had included jokes touching on Islam, various Christian denominations, and religious institutions more broadly. Viewers who defended the episode argued that treating Jesus with the same irreverent style the show applies to virtually every other subject it covers fit consistently within the series' overall identity, rather than representing some unusually harsh or unfair singling out of Christianity above other religions the show had already mocked in different ways over the years. Steve Callahan's comments made before the episode even aired take on additional meaning once placed alongside the actual reaction the episode generated once it reached television screens. By acknowledging ahead of time that the writers expected some viewers to be irritated by the episode, Callahan effectively predicted the exact kind of response that followed once audiences actually watched the finished story. This kind of advance acknowledgement differs meaningfully from the reaction patterns seen in some of the show's other controversial episodes covered earlier in this look at its history. The Weinstein episode drew concern from network executives worried about stereotypes before it aired, while episodes like Quagmire's Dad and A Shot in the Dark aired without any internal hesitation from Fox, only drawing backlash from outside critics and advocacy groups after the fact. This episode falls into a slightly different category, since the show's own production team openly recognized and accepted the likelihood of backlash before a single viewer had actually seen the finished product, treating the controversy almost as an expected and accepted cost of telling the story they wanted to tell. Religious groups responding to the episode also raised a broader point connected to a pattern that had shown up repeatedly across the show's history whenever storylines touched on Jesus specifically. Any depiction of Jesus that strays from traditional, respectful portrayals tends to draw strong reactions from Christian audiences, regardless of which specific comedy or entertainment property attempts it. This sensitivity comes from the central role Jesus holds within Christian belief as a figure meant to represent moral perfection and divine sacrifice, making any portrayal that shows him behaving in ways that contradict those core values likely to draw sharp criticism almost by default. This episode's decision to build an entire storyline around infidelity, deception, and manipulation placed it squarely within that pattern of controversy that almost any non-traditional depiction of Jesus tends to generate, regardless of the specific creative choices made within any individual episode or storyline. Looking at the 2,000-year-old virgin, alongside the other controversial episodes already covered in this look at Family Guy's history, reveals another distinct category of controversy within the show's long run. The Weinstein episode dealt with religious stereotypes aimed at an entire group of people connected connected to Judaism. This episode instead focused its entire controversy on a single, specific religious figure central to an entirely different faith, reimagining Jesus' personality and behavior in a way that directly clashed with the moral teachings most closely associated with him. Rather than mocking a broad stereotype applied to an entire religious community, this episode built its controversy around personally reshaping the character and reputation of one specific figure recognized and revered across an enormous portion of the world's population. The episode closed without providing any lasting consequence for Jesus' attempted deception, allowing him to walk away from the entire situation with his usual behavior pattern seemingly intact and unchanged. Peter and Lois are left to continue their holiday celebration together, their marriage having survived the test Jesus claimed to have set up for them, while Jesus himself disappears from the story with no indication that his habit of pursuing married women will end anytime soon. This kind of ending, where the character causing the most trouble throughout the episode faces no real accountability by the time the credits roll, became one more detail critics pointed toward when arguing that the episode prioritized shock value and irreverent humor over any kind of thoughtful commentary or meaningful resolution tied to the religious themes it had chosen to explore. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every controversial episode Family Guy produced dealt with a subject connected to a specific real-world religion or a widely recognized religious figure. The next chapter in this look at the show's most talked-about moments shifts its focus toward a different religion entirely, built around a storyline that placed one of the show's most familiar characters directly inside a plot involving terrorism, following a chain of events that connected an ordinary trip to Las Vegas with accusations that would follow that character for the rest of the episode. Section 08. Turban Cowboy Family Guy had already spent years drawing criticism for how it portrayed different religious groups, having faced backlash over its treatment of Judaism through an entire banned episode and its treatment of Christianity through a storyline built around Jesus and infidelity. On March 17, 2013, the show turned its attention toward a different faith entirely, airing an episode called Turban Cowboy as the 15th episode of its 11th season and the 203rd episode overall. This episode built its plot around Islam, following Peter as he becomes friends with a Muslim man, converts to the religion himself, and eventually finds himself caught up in a terrorist plot he never meant to be part of. The episode was written by Artie Johan and Sean Reese, and directed by Joe Vo, and it drew criticism both for how it portrayed Muslim characters and, later, for an unrelated piece of timing that had nothing to do with the writers themselves. The story begins with Peter, Quagmire, and Joe sitting around at the Drunken Clam, deciding their lives have grown boring and that they need something new to shake things up. Peter suggests skydiving, and the group takes up the hobby together. Peter becomes especially enthusiastic about it, continuing to jump despite Lois expressing real concern, since nearly every one of his jumps ends in some kind of accident. Eventually, one of these skydiving accidents lands Peter in a hospital, and it happens to occur while he is in Las Vegas, rather than back home in Quahog. While recovering in the hospital, Peter meets another patient named Mahmoud, a Muslim man voiced by guest actor Omid Abtahi. The two men strike up an immediate friendship, getting along well enough that Peter decides to introduce Mahmoud to his usual group of friends once he returns home. When Mahmoud meets Quagmire and Joe back at the Drunken Clam, the group quickly notices that he has very little in common with them. Mahmoud refuses to drink alcohol and does not look at other women the way the rest of the group typically does, both details that immediately set him apart from Peter's usual circle of friends. Rather than this difference creating distance between Peter and Mahmoud, Peter instead becomes curious about the culture and beliefs behind Mahmoud's lifestyle. Mahmoud introduces Peter to different aspects of Islamic culture, and Peter grows increasingly interested in the religion itself, eventually deciding he wants to convert and become a Muslim. Lois expresses some hesitation as Peter begins studying the religion in greater depth, but she ultimately decides to let the situation play out, rather than trying to stop him directly. The story shifts into more serious territory once Mahmoud invites Peter to attend a gathering with other members of the Muslim community. What starts as a simple social invitation turns into something much more dangerous once Peter realizes that the group he has been brought into is actually made up of terrorists planning to blow up a bridge in Quahog. Peter finds himself pulled into this plot without having any real understanding of what he was walking into, having been invited under the impression that he was simply attending a normal religious gathering with new friends rather than being drawn into an act of planned violence. As the plan moves forward, Peter accidentally reveals to the group that he is wearing a hidden microphone, having apparently agreed to help investigate the situation once his friends became suspicious of Mahmoud's true intentions. Once his cover is blown, the terrorists rush their plan into action rather than backing away from it. Peter finds himself held at gunpoint and forced to drive a van loaded with explosives toward the bridge the group intends to destroy. During this tense sequence, Peter attempts to talk Mahmoud out of following through with the bombing, appealing directly to the friendship the two of them had built earlier in the episode, but Mahmoud refuses to change course. Joe arrives just in time to stop the attack, physically knocking the detonator out of Mahmoud's hand before the bomb can be triggered, bringing the immediate danger to an end hand and allowing the authorities to arrest the terrorists involved in the plot. The episode does not end there, closing instead on one more dark joke layered on top of the resolved crisis. After the terrorists are arrested and Peter is praised by his friends for his bravery throughout the ordeal, he calls the drunken clam to reserve a table so the group can celebrate with a drink. In the process of making this call, Peter forgets that his phone had been wired directly into the bomb earlier in the episode as part of the terrorist plot, and the explosive device goes off anyway once he dials the number, closing the story on an abrupt and darkly comedic note, despite the danger already having seemingly passed. Once the episode aired, reviewers responded with criticism focused specifically on how the show handled its Muslim characters throughout the story. A reviewer for the AV Club gave the episode a low grade, arguing that the story relied on outdated and predictable choices once Mahmoud entered the picture, pointing specifically to two plot turns that the reviewer described as poorly handled. The first involved Peter's decision to convert to Islam after observing how submissive Mahmoud's wife behaved around her husband, a detail the reviewer criticized as reducing an entire religious conversion storyline down to an offensive assumption about gender roles within Muslim households. The second turn involved the show doubling down on this uncomfortable foundation by revealing Mahmoud as a terrorist, a choice the reviewer argued relied on an overly familiar and predictable stereotype rather than offering any fresh or thoughtful take on Muslim characters within a comedy setting. Some defenders of the episode pointed to a specific moment where Brian challenges Quagmire and Joe for jumping to suspicious conclusions about Mahmoud simply because of his religion, arguing that this moment showed the show attempting to push back against prejudice rather than simply reinforcing it. Critics who found this defense unconvincing argued that this message ended up undercut by the episode's own plot, since the story ultimately proves Quagmire and Joe's suspicions correct, by revealing that Mahmoud really was involved in a terrorist plot all along. Under this reading, any attempt the episode made to critique prejudice against Muslims got erased by its own ending, which validated the very suspicion the episode initially seemed to be criticizing. The episode did include at least one line that pushed back more directly against blanket stereotypes, with Joe stating during the story that not all Muslims are bad, comparing the situation to how every community, regardless of religion or background, tends to have some individuals capable of doing harmful or dangerous things. Whether this single line was enough to balance out the overall structure of a plot built entirely around a Muslim character turning out to be a terrorist became one of the central points of disagreement among people discussing the episode after it aired, with some viewers feeling it offered meaningful nuance and others feeling it was too small a gesture to offset everything else built into the story around it. Separate from any of the criticism connected to how the episode portrayed Muslim characters, Turban Cowboy became connected to an entirely different controversy through an unfortunate coincidence involving real-world timing. The episode aired on March 17, 2013. Almost exactly 1 month later, on April 15, 2013, two bombs exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, killing several people and injuring hundreds more in an attack that dominated national news coverage for weeks afterward. The individuals responsible for that real attack were later identified as having connections to extremist beliefs tied to their own interpretation of Islam, creating an especially uncomfortable link between the real tragedy and the fictional terrorist plot Turban Cowboy had aired just weeks earlier. Making the coincidence even more uncomfortable, the episode itself contained a scene showing Peter accidentally driving his car through a group of runners during the Boston Marathon, part of an unrelated comedic cutaway gag included earlier in the episode as a quick, absurd joke unconnected to the main terrorist storyline. Once the real bombing took place just weeks later, this specific scene took on an entirely different and much darker meaning than the writers could have intended when they originally created it, since a joke about chaos and violence occurring at the Boston Marathon suddenly sat right next to a real tragedy that had actually happened at that exact same event. Combined with the episode's separate plot involving a Muslim terrorist attempting to bomb a bridge, the timing created a situation where two completely different pieces of the same episode each independently echoed real-world violence that had not yet occurred at the time the episode was written and produced. As a direct result of this coincidence, Turban Cowboy ended up pulled from syndication and streaming platforms for an extended period of time following the real Boston Marathon bombing. Rather than continuing to air alongside other episodes of the season, the episode was quietly removed from circulation, based on the combination of its marathon-related cutaway joke and its broader terrorist storyline involving Muslim characters, both of which suddenly felt far too close to a real and painful national tragedy to continue airing casually as part of normal syndicated reruns. This makes Turban Cowboy different from every other controversial episode covered so far in this look at the show's history. The Weinstein episode and Partial Terms of Endearment were held back or banned specifically because of decisions made about their content itself. Turban Cowboy instead became controversial partly because of choices baked into the writing from the very beginning, and partly because of a real-world tragedy that had nothing to do with the show at all, striking close enough to the episode's own subject matter to make its continued broadcast feel deeply inappropriate once that tragedy actually occurred. Turban Cowboy remains a clear example of how a piece of entertainment can become entangled with real-world events entirely outside its creative creator's control, turning what might have otherwise stayed a fairly ordinary, moderately controversial episode into something far more sensitive once actual violence gave its jokes an unintended and painful new context. The episode shows that controversy connected to a television show does not always come purely from choices made by writers sitting in a room deciding what jokes to include. Sometimes the world outside the studio reshapes how a piece of already finished entertainment gets received, long after the episode itself has already aired and moved on to what would have otherwise been a normal spot in the show's back catalog of past seasons. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every controversy connected to Family Guy came from a single episode built around one specific storyline or one unfortunate coincidence involving real-world timing. The next chapter in this look at the show's most talked about moments turns away from individual episodes entirely, focusing instead on one organization that spent decades keeping a constant, watchful eye on the series, filing complaint after complaint, and building a running record of exactly how many times it believed the show had crossed a line worth calling out publicly. Section 09. The Parents Television Council War. Every controversial episode covered so far in this look at Family Guy's history involved a single storyline, a specific joke, or one particular piece of unfortunate timing. Behind nearly every one of those individual controversies sat the same organization, watching closely, keeping records, and speaking out again and again over the course of more than 2 decades. That organization is the Parents Television Council, a conservative watchdog group that has criticized Family Guy since the very first season the show aired back in 1999. Rather than focusing on just one episode or one specific joke, this section looks at the entire relationship between the show and the group that spent years treating it as one of its most frequent targets, filing complaint after complaint and building a running public record of exactly how often it believed the show had gone too far. The Parents Television Council describes its own mission as advocating for family-friendly programming on television, working to identify and call attention to content the group considers indecent, overly violent, or inappropriate for younger viewers who might be watching alongside their families. As part of this mission, the organization has spent years monitoring network programming closely and filing official complaints with the Federal Communications Commission, the government agency responsible for regulating what kind of content can air on public broadcast television, particularly during hours when children are more likely to be watching. Filing a complaint with the Federal Communications Commission is a formal process, one that can lead to fines or other regulatory consequences for a network if the agency agrees that a broadcast violated indecency standards. Because Family Guy aired on network television rather than on a subscription-based cable channel, it fell squarely within the kind of programming the Federal Communications Commission has authority to review, making it a natural and frequent target for a group specifically focused on holding broadcast networks accountable. The Parents Television Council's opposition to Family Guy did not wait for the show to build a large audience or a long history before beginning. The group was already critical of the series during its very first season, and this criticism intensified once the show returned from a lengthy break during its second season. In May of 2000, the organization specifically lobbied the Fox network to cancel Family Guy entirely, arguing at the time that the show was already facing what the group described as strong resistance from advertisers, along with weak ratings performance. This early call for cancellation came years before the show's actual cancellations in 2000 and 2002, showing that the Parents Television Council had identified Family Guy as a problem almost from the very beginning of its run, long before most casual viewers had even had the chance to discover the series for themselves. Over the years that followed, the organization included Family Guy on several of its published lists, ranking the worst programs on television for family viewing. The show appeared on these lists in the years 2000, 2005, and 2006, each time cited specifically for a combination of factors including profanity, animated nudity, and violence appearing throughout different episodes. Beyond these yearly lists, the Parents Television Council developed an ongoing, recurring feature specifically dedicated to calling out individual episodes it found particularly objectionable, a designation known as Worst TV Show of the Week. Since 2005 alone, the organization named Family Guy to this designation on at least 40 separate occasions, meaning the show was singled out this way an average of multiple times every single year across more than a decade of ongoing criticism. No other detail captures the sheer scale of this ongoing conflict better than that number, since very few television shows in history have drawn this kind of sustained, repeated criticism from the same watchdog organization across so many individual episodes spread out over so many different seasons. Specific episodes drew especially pointed criticism from the organization over the years, often tied to jokes appearing within the show's trademark cutaway gags rather than the main storylines themselves. In the episode The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire, the group specifically objected to a scene showing Peter and a group of men forming a barbershop quartet, singing and dancing around the bed of a man dying from advanced complications connected to AIDS. Turning a scene involving a man in the final stages of a serious illness into a lighthearted musical number struck the organization as an example of the show mining tragedy and suffering for comedy in a way that crossed an important line line, regardless of how the writers themselves may have viewed the joke's intent. Religious content became another consistent flashpoint in the ongoing back and forth between the show and the organization, connecting directly to some of the controversies already covered earlier in this look at Family Guy's history. In an episode called The Courtship of Stewie's Father, the Parents Television Council specifically pointed to a cutaway gag depicting God engaging in a sexual encounter with a prostitute, an image the group considered deeply disrespectful toward a figure treated as sacred across multiple major world religions. This kind of complaint follows the same basic pattern seen with the criticism aimed at both the Weinstein episode and the 2,000-year-old virgin, showing that episodes touching directly on religious figures or religious groups consistently drew some of the strongest and most sustained objections from the organization across the entire run of the show. The relationship between Family Guy and the Parents Television Council eventually became something the show itself began addressing directly within its own episodes, turning the ongoing criticism into fuel for its own jokes rather than simply absorbing the complaints quietly from the sidelines. An episode called PTV was built specifically as a response to the broader push by watchdog groups and the Federal Communications Commission to increase censorship across television more generally, using the show's own platform to satirize the exact kind of oversight organizations like the Parents Television Council had spent years pushing for. Following that episode's broadcast, the Parents Television Council reportedly considered filing a formal complaint over its content, a moment that captured the strange, almost circular nature of a show mocking the very group that regularly criticized it, only for that same group to consider responding to the mockery with another official complaint. The show went even further in directly referencing the organization within another episode, already covered earlier in this look at Family Guy's history. In the 2,000-year-old virgin, the episode built entirely around Jesus and his repeated pattern of infidelity. Peter is shown directing people to file complaints with an organization called the Family Television Council, a name clearly designed as a thinly disguised stand-in for the real Parents Television Council. This detail shows that even while the show was actively creating an episode likely to draw fresh criticism from religious viewers and watchdog groups alike, the writers were simultaneously building in a direct, pointed reference back toward the very organization they knew would likely respond to that same episode once it aired. The relationship between the two sides did not remain locked in permanent conflict forever. Following the 2015 airing of an episode called Our Idiot Brian, the Parents Television Council again publicly criticized Seth MacFarlane, this time specifically over a joke involving two depictions of male anatomy that closed out the episode. Rather than responding to this latest complaint with another round of satire or dismissal, MacFarlane took an unusual step. He extended an offer directly to Tim Winter, the president of the Parents Television Council at the time, giving Winter the choice to either write an episode of the show himself or select two writers of his own choosing to take on the task instead. This offer reportedly caught Winter completely off guard, since it represented a level of direct engagement neither side had previously extended toward the other across more than a decade of ongoing public criticism. Following this offer, extended communication took place between MacFarlane and Winter, during which MacFarlane reportedly listened to genuine concerns raised by the organization regarding the show's content. This exchange eventually led to a notable easing of tensions between the two sides, described afterward as the two men effectively burying the hatchet after years of public back-and-forth criticism. Looking back across this entire history reveals something different from every other controversy already covered in this look at Family Guy's most talked-about moments. Every previous section focused on one specific episode, built around one particular storyline that drew backlash either before or after it aired. This ongoing conflict with the Parents Television Council instead stretched across the show's entire run, touching dozens of individual episodes spanning religion, violence, sexual content, and everything in between, creating a kind of running scoreboard that existed completely separate from any single storyline or character. Rather than one moment of controversy followed by a resolution, this relationship played out continuously in the background of nearly every season the show ever produced, occasionally flaring up around a specific episode before settling back into its familiar rhythm of ongoing criticism and equally ongoing indifference from the show's creative team. The eventual softening of tensions between MacFarlane and Winter also stands apart from how most of the other controversies covered so far in this look at the show's history were resolved, if they were resolved at all. Episodes like Partial Terms of Endearment remained permanently banned from broadcast with no later reversal. Quagmire's Dad continued drawing criticism from advocacy groups for years after its original airing, without any direct engagement between MacFarlane and those groups. The relationship between the show and the Parents Television Council stands out specifically because it eventually moved beyond a one-sided pattern of criticism followed by silence, becoming instead a rare example of direct, personal communication between the person responsible for the show's content and the person responsible for organizing complaints against it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every lasting controversy connected to Family Guy came from an ongoing pattern spread across dozens of episodes over many years. The next chapter in this look at the show's most talked about moments returns to a single specific episode once again, this time built around an unusual crossover event that brought two of television's television's longest-running animated families together under one roof, only for a single joke buried inside that crossover to spark a fresh wave of criticism from the very organization already covered in detail throughout this section. Section 10. The Simpsons Guy crossover joke. Family Guy had already spent over a decade being compared to The Simpsons, often unfavorably by critics who saw it as a cruder copy of a show that had come first and built a much longer legacy of critical respect. On September 28, 2014, the two shows finally came together directly, airing a one-hour crossover episode called The Simpsons Guy as the premiere of Family Guy's 13th season. The episode brought the Griffin family into direct contact with the Simpson family for the first time, and while most of the excitement surrounding the crossover focused on seeing these two long-running animated families interact, one specific joke buried inside the episode ended up drawing far more attention than anything else the crossover produced. The episode was written by Patrick Mahan and directed by Peter Shin, a supervising director who had previously worked as a layout artist on The Simpsons before joining the Family Guy team, giving him direct experience with both shows before taking on the difficult task of blending their visual styles together for this single special episode. The story begins with Peter creating a comic strip for the local Quahog newspaper after growing frustrated with an unfunny strip already running there. His comic becomes popular with readers at first, but it eventually draws serious backlash once its humor is recognized as offensive toward women. Rather than the controversy simply fading on its own, Peter makes the situation worse by attempting to defend himself and clear his name during an appearance on a local television show, a decision that backfires and only intensifies the anger directed at him. Facing an angry mob of women gathered outside the Griffin house, Peter and his family decide to flee Quahog entirely until the controversy has time to settle down. While driving through the night trying to escape the backlash, the Griffins stop at a gas station, only to have their car stolen while they are inside, leaving the entire family stranded near the town of Springfield, the fictional home of the Simpsons. Walking through the unfamiliar town, they eventually encounter Homer Simpson, who greets them warmly despite having no idea who they are. Homer takes the stranded family under his wing, eventually bringing them to stay with the Simpson family while they figure out how to get back home to Quahog. This sets up the bulk of the episode's crossover material, allowing characters from both shows to interact directly with one another for the first time in the history of either series. Several smaller storylines unfold once the Griffins settle into Springfield temporarily. Homer and Peter get into an ongoing rivalry over whose favorite beer tastes better, comparing Peter's fictional Pawtucket Patriot Ale against Homer's beloved Duff beer, eventually discovering that Pawtucket Patriot is actually a cheap knockoff of Duff, leading the two families into a legal dispute over the matter. Lisa Simpson takes an interest in helping Meg Griffin, offering to teach her how to play the saxophone after learning that Meg does not feel particularly skilled at anything, a moment that gives one of Family Guy's most frequently mocked characters an unusually kind and supportive storyline within the crossover. The most significant new friendship formed during the episode develops between Stewie Griffin and Bart Simpson, two mischievous young characters from their respective shows who quickly bond over shared interests in pranks and troublemaking. Bart introduces Stewie to his slingshot and teaches him how to skateboard, while Stewie trades away his own advanced mind control device in exchange for Bart's slingshot, a swap that shows Stewie genuinely values the simple, old-fashioned kind of mischief Bart represents over his own more advanced and dangerous inventions. The two boys also spend time together making prank phone calls to Moe Sheslack, a bartender character from The Simpsons who has served as the target of prank calls from Bart throughout that show's own long history. It was during one of these prank call scenes that the episode's most talked about joke took place. After Bart demonstrates his usual style of prank call, tricking Moe with a joke built around an embarrassing-sounding name, Stewie decides to attempt a prank call of his own. Rather than following the same lighthearted pattern Bart had just shown him, Stewie calls Moe and tells him that his sister is being raped. Moe reacts with immediate shock and confusion, asking a rapid series of questions trying to understand what Stewie is talking about. Clearly caught off guard by the disturbing nature of the claim, rather than treating it as an obviously harmless prank in the same way he had responded to Bart's earlier joke. Bart's own reaction to Stewie's prank call in this moment is one of visible shock and discomfort, staring at Stewie with an expression that made clear even Bart, a character known for his own long history of mischief and pranks, found this particular joke to be a step too far compared to his own usual style of harmless teasing. This joke drew significant attention even before the episode officially aired, since it had already been included in promotional material released ahead of the broadcast. Seeing the joke appear in a trailer meant that criticism began building before most viewers had even watched the full episode, giving the controversy a head start compared to some of the show's other controversial moments that only drew backlash once audiences had already seen the complete story play out. Once concerns began circulating about the joke, Tim Winter, the president of the Parents Television Council, the same organization covered in detail in the previous section of this look at Family Guy's history, took direct action by writing letters addressed to Simpsons creator Matt Groening, Family Guy creator Seth MacFarlane, and Fox itself, raising formal concerns about the specific joke involving Stewie's prank call to Moe. Winter's argument against the joke focused on two separate but related concerns. First, he argued that making making jokes centered on rape risks making the subject feel less serious or less outrageous when it actually occurs in real life, suggesting that treating something this severe as a punchline could gradually normalize attitudes that downplay the seriousness of sexual assault as a real-world issue. Second, and more specific to this particular crossover episode, Winter pointed out that many viewers watching specifically for the Simpsons portion of the crossover might not be regular Family Guy viewers themselves, meaning children and families tuning in primarily for a show with a long history of relatively tamer content could suddenly be exposed to Family Guy's much more explicit and boundary-pushing style of humor without any real warning that the tone would shift so sharply within the same hour-long broadcast. This crossover-specific concern set Winter's criticism apart from many of the organization's earlier complaints about the show, since it focused not just on the joke's content in isolation, but on the unique risk created by placing that joke inside an episode designed to draw in an audience that might not already be familiar with Family Guy's usual style of humor. Fox's response to Winter's letter was notably brief. A spokesperson for the network declined to offer any comment when asked about the joke, choosing not to defend or apologize for its inclusion in the finished episode. This kind of non-response differs from some of the network's earlier handling of Family Guy controversies covered elsewhere in this look at the show's history, where decisions to delay or ban entire episodes showed a much more active, hands-on approach to managing sensitive content before it ever reached air. In this case, the joke had already aired exactly as written, and Fox simply chose silence rather than either defending the joke's inclusion or distancing itself from the criticism being raised against it. Seth MacFarlane did eventually address the surrounding controversy directly in an interview with Entertainment Weekly following the episode's broadcast. Rather than issuing an apology or expressing regret over the joke's inclusion, MacFarlane's comments reflected the same general approach the show had taken toward controversial material throughout its entire run, treating public backlash as an expected and largely unavoidable byproduct of the specific brand of comedy Family Guy had built its reputation around since its earliest seasons. This response fits a consistent pattern already visible across many of the other controversies covered throughout this look at the show's history, where MacFarlane and the show's writing staff generally stood behind their creative choices rather than backing away from them once criticism began building following a broadcast. Despite the controversy surrounding this specific joke, the crossover episode as a whole received a generally positive reception from both critics and fans of both shows once it aired in full. The episode carries a strong average rating on IMDb, reflecting enthusiasm from longtime viewers who had wanted to see these two families interact for years before the crossover finally became a reality. Reviewers who covered the episode more broadly tended to praise specific elements like the extended, increasingly absurd fight sequence between Peter and Homer, which escalated into the two characters gaining temporary superpowers and eventually crossing paths with alien characters from The Simpsons' own long-running science fiction parody segments. At the same time, some reviews specifically noted the rape joke as one of the episode's weaker and more uncomfortable moments, showing that even among generally favorable coverage of the crossover, this particular piece of dialogue stood out as a specific point of criticism rather than being fully embraced as part of the episode's overall success. Placing this controversy alongside the ongoing history between Family Guy and the Parents Television Council covered in the previous section reveals an important connection between these two chapters of the show's story. Rather than representing an entirely new or separate type of conflict, this crossover controversy fits directly into the same decades-long pattern already established between the show and the organization, following the same basic structure of a joke airing, the council responding with formal criticism, and the network largely declining to engage directly with the complaint. What makes this particular instance distinct within that larger pattern is the added element of a crossover audience, since Winter's argument specifically hinged on viewers unfamiliar with Family Guy's typical content being caught off guard by a joke this dark appearing inside an episode built around two combined fan bases rather than Family Guy's usual audience alone. Looking back across every episode and controversy covered throughout this entire look at Family Guy's history, from a show that nearly disappeared for good after two separate cancellations, through years of episodes touching on religion, gender identity, real-world tragedy, domestic violence, and an ongoing decades-long battle with a dedicated watchdog organization, a clear pattern emerges. Family Guy built its identity around pushing directly into subjects most comedies chose to avoid entirely, absorbing criticism from nearly every direction along the way, while rarely backing down from the specific creative choices that generated that criticism in the first place. The show survived cancellation, survived network bans on individual episodes, survived backlash from advocacy groups representing multiple different communities, and survived decades of formal complaints from an organization dedicated specifically to holding it accountable. Through all of it, the show continued producing new seasons for over 2 decades, standing as one of the longest-running examples in television history of a series that turned controversy itself into an inseparable part of its own identity, rather than something to be carefully avoided along the way.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.